The wind howled like a hungry wolf, clawing at the small, ramshackle cabin that clung precariously to the side of the hill. Inside, Sarah huddled with her 2 children, Thomas, age 7, and little Emily, barely 5. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, offering little warmth against the biting chill of the approaching winter. Life on the homestead had always been hard, a constant battle against the unforgiving land. But since her husband, Jebediah, had succumbed to a fever 3 months ago, it had become a daily struggle for survival. Sarah glanced at her children. Thomas, despite his young age, tried to be strong, mimicking his father's stoic demeanor. He would often attempt to help with chores, his small hands struggling to manage tasks meant for a grown man. Emily, with her bright blue eyes and a spirit that even hardship couldn't dim, clung to her mother's side, seeking comfort and reassurance. Sarah knew she had to be strong for them, even when her own heart felt like a shattered piece of glass. Their small farm, carved out of the wilderness with Jebediah's sweat and calloused hands, was all they had. They grew corn and beans, raised a few chickens, and hunted small game to supplement their meager rations. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive, enough to hold on to the dream of a better future. But Jebediah's death had cast a long shadow. The work that 2 people could barely manage now fell solely on Sarah's shoulders. The crops were failing, the chickens weren't laying, and the winter promised to be particularly harsh. Sarah worried constantly about how she would provide for her children, how she would keep them safe and warm. She spent sleepless nights mending clothes, patching the roof, and praying for a miracle. She remembered Jebediah's strong arms around her, his reassuring voice promising a life filled with love and prosperity. Now, only the echoes of those promises remained, mingling with the mournful cry of the wind. Despite her grief and fear, Sarah refused to give up. She owed it to Jebediah, and more importantly, she owed it to her children to fight for their survival, to cling to hope in the face of despair. She would face the winter head-on, just as Jebediah would have wanted her to. She would find a way. She had to. The next morning dawned cold and gray, mirroring the apprehension that gnawed at Sarah's insides. She was outside, trying to coax a fire in the cook stove, when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Wagons, 2 of them, lumbering slowly towards the homestead. Her heart leaped with a flicker of hope. Perhaps it was a traveling merchant, someone who could trade for some of her dwindling supplies. But as the wagons drew closer, her hope turned to dread. She recognized the harsh, angular faces of Jebediah's older brother, Silas, and his wife, Martha. They had never approved of Jebediah's marriage to Sarah, a woman they considered beneath him. They had visited only once, years ago, their disdain thinly veiled behind polite smiles. Silas and Martha climbed down from the lead wagon, their expressions grim. 2 burly men, presumably hired hands, stood behind them, their arms crossed, their eyes hard. Sarah felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "Sarah," Silas greeted her, his voice devoid of warmth. "We've come about Jebediah's affairs." Martha sniffed, looking around the dilapidated homestead with undisguised disgust. "A sorry state he left things in, wouldn't you say, Silas?" Sarah stood her ground, her chin lifted. "Jebediah worked hard for everything we have." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Hard work? More like foolishness. This land is worthless, a waste of good resources. But," he added, his eyes narrowing, "it is rightfully ours now." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Silas produced a crumpled document from his coat pocket. "Jebediah never made a proper will. As his closest living relatives, we are his legal heirs. This land, this cabin, everything here belongs to us now." Sarah stared at the document, her mind reeling. She couldn't read. Jebediah had always handled the paperwork. But she could see the official-looking seals, the spidery handwriting. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where'll we go? This is our home." Martha stepped forward, her face a mask of cruel satisfaction. "That's not our concern. We're giving you 1 hour to gather your belongings and leave." After that, we'll be changing the locks." Sarah looked at her children, who had come outside, drawn by the commotion. Thomas stood protectively in front of Emily, his small face etched with fear. Sarah knew she couldn't fight them. She was alone, outnumbered, and they held all the power. "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Just give us a little time. A few days to find somewhere to go." Silas's eyes were like chips of flint. "1 hour, Sarah. That's all you're getting." Desperation fueled Sarah's actions. She frantically gathered what few possessions she could carry: a warm blanket, some dried beans, a small bag of flour, and Jebediah's old hunting knife. She packed them into a threadbare sack, her hands trembling. Thomas helped, his brow furrowed with worry, grabbing a few of his favorite toys. Emily clung to her mother, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. The hour passed in a blur of frantic activity. Silas and Martha watched them with cold indifference, their hired hands standing guard, preventing Sarah from taking anything of real value. The cow, the chickens, the tools that Jebediah had painstakingly collected over the years. They were stripping her bare, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the love for her children. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows, Silas gestured impatiently. "Time's up, Sarah. Get off my land." Sarah led her children out of the cabin, her heart heavy with despair. She turned back to look at the only home they had ever known, tears streaming down her face. The cabin, silhouetted against the setting sun, seemed to shrink, to fade into the vastness of the landscape. It was gone. Everything was gone. Silas watched her, unmoved. He barked an order to one of the hired hands, who began to nail boards across the door and windows of the cabin. The sound echoed through the silent valley, a final, brutal punctuation mark on Sarah's past. With nowhere to go, Sarah started walking, leading her children down the dusty track that led away from the homestead. Thomas walked beside her, his small hand gripping hers tightly. Emily, exhausted and frightened, stumbled along, her lower lip trembling. The landscape stretched before them, vast and unforgiving. The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of dust and sagebrush. The night grew darker, colder. Sarah knew they couldn't walk much further. They needed shelter, water, and food. But where would they find it? They were alone, adrift in a hostile wilderness, abandoned by those who should have offered them comfort and support. She wrapped her arms around her children, drawing them close, trying to shield them from the harsh reality of their situation. She would not let them see her break. She would find a way. She had to, for them. The days that followed were a blur of hardship and uncertainty. Sarah and her children walked along the dusty trail, their feet blistered and sore. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the landscape into a shimmering oven. The small amount of water they had carried was quickly depleted, and their throats grew parched. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. The dried beans were soon gone, and the small bag of flour offered little sustenance. Sarah tried to forage for edible plants, but she was unfamiliar with the local flora and wary of poisonous berries. She rationed what little food they had, giving the larger portion to her children, even as her own stomach ached with emptiness. Emily, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, began to lag behind. Sarah carried her for as long as she could, but her own strength was failing. Thomas, despite his young age, tried to help, carrying Emily's small doll and offering words of encouragement. One afternoon, they stumbled upon a dry creek bed. Sarah dug frantically in the parched earth, hoping to find a trickle of water. After what seemed like an eternity, her fingers brushed against dampness. She dug deeper, widening the hole, until a small pool of muddy water began to form. It wasn't much, but it was enough to quench their immediate thirst. They spent the night huddled beneath a rocky overhang, seeking shelter from the wind. Sarah built a small fire, using twigs and dry grass. The flames flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the rock face. She wrapped her arms around her children, trying to keep them warm. As she looked at their faces, gaunt and tired, a wave of despair washed over her. She had promised to protect them, to provide for them, but she was failing. She didn't know how much longer they could survive in this harsh environment. But then she saw the spark of resilience in their eyes, the unwavering trust they placed in her. And she knew she couldn't give up. She had to keep going, to keep searching for a way out of this nightmare. She owed it to them, to Jebediah, to herself. She would find a way. She had to. The next morning, they set out again, their bodies weary, their spirits tested, but their determination unbroken. They were lost, alone, and vulnerable, but they were not defeated. They would face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. They would survive. High on a rocky ridge, overlooking the winding trail, a lone figure stood silhouetted against the azure sky. It was Little Bear, a young Cheyenne warrior separated from his scouting party days ago during a sudden, violent thunderstorm. He was lean and wiry, with the sharp, observant eyes of a hunter. His face, bronzed by the sun and etched with the wisdom of his people, was impassive, betraying nothing of his thoughts. He had been tracking a herd of antelope when the storm hit, scattering the animals and separating him from his companions. He had spent the past few days searching for their tracks, but the relentless rain had washed away all traces. He knew he had to find his way back to the tribe, but the vastness of the plains made it a daunting task. As he scanned the horizon, his gaze fell upon a small group of figures moving slowly along the trail below. He recognized them as white settlers, a woman and two young children. He watched them for a long time, his expression unreadable. He knew little of the white man, only that they were encroaching on Cheyenne lands, disrupting the balance of nature, and threatening the survival of his people. But as he observed the woman and her children, he saw something different. He saw their struggle, their exhaustion, their vulnerability. He saw the woman's unwavering determination to protect her young ones, the way she shielded them from the harsh sun, the way she shared what little food they had. He knew they were alone, lost, and in desperate need of help. His instincts, honed by years of living close to the land, told him they were in danger. The wilderness was unforgiving, and many threats lurked beneath its seemingly peaceful surface. He hesitated. He was a warrior, sworn to protect his tribe, not to aid the enemy. But the Cheyenne were also a people of compassion, of respect for all life. He remembered the stories his grandfather had told him, tales of kindness and understanding, of helping those in need, regardless of their origin. He watched as the woman and her children stumbled onward, their figures growing smaller in the distance. He knew he had a decision to make. Would he turn his back on them, leaving them to their fate? Or would he follow them, offering them his help, risking the disapproval of his tribe? The weight of his decision settled heavily upon his shoulders. He knew what he had to do. He began to descend from the ridge, his moccasins silent on the rocky ground. He would follow them. He would observe them. And if they were truly in need, he would offer them his aid. The sun beat down with relentless intensity as Sarah and her children trudged wearily through a narrow canyon. The walls of rock offered little shade, and the air hung heavy and still. Emily, her face pale and drawn, stumbled, nearly falling. Sarah reached out to steady her, her heart pounding with concern. Suddenly, a sharp, rattling sound pierced the silence. Sarah froze, her eyes darting around, searching for the source. Thomas screamed, pointing to the ground near Emily's feet. A large rattlesnake, its scales shimmering in the sunlight, was coiled and ready to strike. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that a bite from the snake could be fatal, especially for a child as weak as Emily. She grabbed a rock, ready to defend her children, but she knew it was a desperate measure. The snake was too fast, too deadly. Before she could act, a blur of motion flashed past her. Little Bear, who had been silently following them, leaped forward with incredible speed and agility. With a swift, precise movement, he pinned the snake's head to the ground with a forked stick. The snake thrashed wildly, its rattles buzzing furiously, but Little Bear held it firmly in place. He then carefully lifted the snake and carried it away from Sarah and her children, releasing it into the undergrowth. Sarah stared at him, her heart still racing, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. She had seen him only as a shadowy figure in the distance, a silent observer. Now he was standing before her, a warrior, a protector. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "You saved our lives." Little Bear nodded, his expression impassive. He said nothing, but his eyes held a depth of understanding and compassion. He turned and walked away, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Sarah watched him go, her mind filled with questions. Who was he? Why had he helped them? Was he friend or foe? She didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. They owed him their lives. She had to trust him. She had to believe that he was there to help them, not to harm them. For her children's sake, she had to believe. She knelt down beside Emily, checking her for any signs of injury. Emily clung to her mother, her small body trembling with fear. Sarah hugged her tightly, whispering words of comfort and reassurance. The encounter with the rattlesnake had shaken them all, but had also revealed something unexpected, a glimmer of hope in the midst of their despair. A stranger had appeared, a warrior, a protector, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would be their salvation. That night, as they huddled around their small fire, Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. Little Bear's sudden appearance and silent departure had left her both grateful and deeply suspicious. She had heard stories about the Cheyenne, tales of fierce warriors and brutal raids. Could she really trust this man, even though he had saved their lives? She glanced at her children, sleeping soundly beside her, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. She had to protect them, and that meant being cautious, even wary. She clutched Jebediah's hunting knife, her knuckles white. The next morning, as they resumed their journey, Little Bear reappeared, walking a short distance behind them, never approaching, never speaking. Sarah tried to ignore him, but his presence was a constant reminder of her precarious situation. She tried to communicate with him, to ask him his name, to understand his intentions, but the language barrier proved insurmountable. She spoke to him in English, but he showed no sign of understanding. He, in turn, spoke to her in his native tongue, a series of guttural sounds and unfamiliar inflections that were completely foreign to her ears. Frustration mounted. She tried simple gestures, pointing to herself and saying "Sarah," then pointing to him, hoping he would reciprocate. He seemed to understand, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. She realized that communication would be difficult, if not impossible. They were separated by a chasm of language and culture, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Despite her reservations, Sarah couldn't deny that Little Bear's presence offered a sense of security. He was clearly skilled in the ways of the wilderness, and his watchful eyes seemed to scan the landscape for any potential threats. She knew that he could protect them from dangers she couldn't even imagine. But the fear remained, a nagging doubt that whispered in the back of her mind. Could she truly trust him? Or was he leading them into a trap? She didn't know. All she could do was watch, wait, and hope that her instincts would guide her in the right direction. She knew that the fate of her children depended on it. She had to be strong, she had to be smart, and she had to be prepared for anything. The wilderness was a dangerous place, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Or could she? The question haunted her as they walked on, the silent Cheyenne warrior watching over them from a distance. The next day, Little Bear's actions began to chip away at Sarah's distrust. He led them to a hidden spring, nestled among the rocks, where clear, cool water gurgled up from the earth. He showed her how to cup her hands to drink, and she watched as her children, their faces radiant with relief, quenched their thirst. Later, he disappeared into the surrounding hills, returning with a rabbit he had snared. Using gestures, he showed Sarah how to skin and clean it. He then built a small fire and roasted the rabbit, sharing the meager meal with them. It was the first real food they had eaten in days, and Sarah felt her strength returning with each bite. As evening approached, Little Bear led them to a sheltered cave, hidden behind a curtain of willows. It was small, but it offered protection from the wind and the elements. He gathered dry leaves and grass, creating a makeshift bed for Sarah and her children. He communicated through a combination of sign language, gestures, and simple drawings in the dirt. He pointed to the sky, then to himself, indicating that he would keep watch throughout the night. He drew a picture of a wolf, then shook his head, warning them of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. Sarah watched him, her heart softening. His actions spoke louder than words. He was not a fierce warrior, intent on harm, but a kind and resourceful man, doing everything he could to help them survive. She began to understand that he saw them not as enemies, but as fellow human beings, struggling against the harsh realities of the wilderness. He was offering them his protection, his knowledge, and his compassion, without asking for anything in return. The language barrier still existed, but it no longer seemed insurmountable. They were communicating through their actions, through their shared humanity. Sarah began to feel a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps, with Little Bear's help, they could find a way to survive. She still didn't fully trust him, but her suspicion was slowly giving way to gratitude and respect. She knew that they were still vulnerable, still in danger, but she also knew that they were no longer alone. They had an ally, a protector, a friend, and that made all the difference. She looked at Little Bear, his face silhouetted against the firelight, and offered him a small, hesitant smile. He returned the smile, his eyes filled with warmth. A silent understanding passed between them, a promise of mutual support and respect. They were from different worlds, but they were united by their shared humanity, their common struggle for survival. Over the next few days, the bond between Sarah and Little Bear deepened. The initial wariness began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of trust and mutual respect. They were still separated by language and culture, but they found ways to connect, to share their stories, to understand each other on a deeper level. Using gestures and drawings in the dirt, Sarah told Little Bear about her life on the homestead, about her love for Jebediah, about the joy and challenges of raising Thomas and Emily. She drew pictures of their small cabin, their fields of corn, their chickens and cow. She showed him how they worked the land, how they struggled to survive, how they dreamed of a better future. Little Bear, in turn, shared stories of his own life, of his tribe, of the Cheyenne way of life. He drew pictures of their teepees, their horses, their buffalo hunts. He showed her how they lived in harmony with nature, how they respected the land, how they honored their ancestors. He told her about his family, his father, a respected warrior, his mother, a skilled weaver, his younger sister, who loved to play by the river. He drew a picture of his village, nestled in a valley, surrounded by towering mountains. Sarah learned that Little Bear was separated from his tribe during a scouting mission and was trying to find his way back home. She understood his longing for his family, his desire to return to his people. As they shared their stories, Sarah realized that they had more in common than she had initially thought. They were both parents, fiercely protective of their children. They both valued family, community, and tradition. They both knew the meaning of hard work, sacrifice, and resilience. They were from different worlds, but they shared the same human heart. They understood each other's joys, each other's sorrows, each other's fears. And in that understanding, a bond of trust was forged, a bond that transcended language and culture. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Sarah pointed to Thomas and Emily, then to Little Bear, then to herself, and then drew a circle around them all in the dirt. She looked at Little Bear, her eyes filled with gratitude and affection. He understood. He nodded, his eyes filled with warmth. They were a family now, bound together by circumstance, by shared experiences, and by a growing love. They would face whatever challenges lay ahead together. They would survive together. Their unlikely alliance had become a beacon of hope in the vast and unforgiving wilderness. The fragile peace they had found was shattered one sweltering afternoon. Little Bear, ever vigilant, noticed the telltale sign first, a distant dust cloud rising on the horizon. He studied it intently, his brow furrowed with concern. Using gestures, he warned Sarah to be cautious, indicating that danger was approaching. As the dust cloud drew closer, Sarah recognized the familiar shape of wagons, 2 of them, just like before. Her heart leaped in her throat. Silas and Martha. They had returned. Panic surged through her. She had hoped they would be satisfied with taking her land, that they would leave her and her children alone. But now, she realized that their cruelty knew no bounds. They weren't just content with stealing her home. They wanted to ensure she didn't survive. "They're back," she whispered to Little Bear, her voice trembling. "They want to hurt us." Little Bear's face hardened. He understood the threat immediately. He knew that these people were not just greedy, but also ruthless. He had seen such cruelty before, in the eyes of those who sought to destroy his people. He quickly assessed their situation. They were in a relatively exposed area, with little cover. The cave where they had been sleeping was too far away to reach in time. They needed to find a defensible position, and they needed to be prepared to fight. Using gestures, he instructed Sarah to gather Thomas and Emily and hide behind a cluster of large rocks. He then armed himself with his knife and his bow, an arrow, his eyes scanning the approaching wagons. Sarah obeyed without question, her fear overshadowed by a surge of protectiveness. She would do anything to protect her children, even if it meant facing Silas and Martha again. As the wagons drew closer, Silas and Martha emerged, their faces grim and determined. The 2 hired hands stood behind them, their expressions menacing. Well, Silas sneered, his eyes falling upon Sarah. "Look what we found. Thought you could just disappear, did you? We can't have you running around telling stories." Martha stepped forward, her face contorted with hatred. "We're here to finish what we started. This time, there will be no mistakes." Little Bear stepped out from behind the rocks, his presence a silent challenge. He stood between Sarah and her children and the approaching threat, a lone warrior standing against overwhelming odds. The stage was set for a confrontation. Their lives depended on it. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Silas, emboldened by his hired hands, ordered them to seize Sarah and the children. But Little Bear was ready. With a speed that belied his lean frame, he unleashed an arrow, striking the rifle from the hand of one of the hired men. Chaos erupted. The hired men, surprised and disoriented, charged at Little Bear, brandishing their fists. Little Bear, using his knowledge of the land, nimbly dodged their attacks, leading them into a thicket of thorny bushes. Sarah watched in horror, clutching her children tightly. She wanted to help Little Bear, but she knew that any attempt to intervene would only put them all in greater danger. Little Bear fought with a ferocity and skill that amazed her. He used his knife and his bow and arrow with deadly precision, disabling his attackers without killing them. He knew that taking a life would only escalate the conflict, and he wanted to avoid bloodshed if possible. He tripped one of the men, sending him sprawling onto the rocky ground. He then disarmed the other, using a swift kick to send his rifle flying into the distance. The hired men, bruised and battered, realized they were outmatched. They looked at Silas and Martha, their faces pleading for instructions. Silas, his face red with rage, grabbed a pistol from his coat pocket. He aimed it at Little Bear, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You savage," he screamed. "I'll kill you myself." Before Silas could fire, Little Bear moved with lightning speed. He threw a handful of dirt into Silas's eyes, blinding him momentarily. He then leaped forward, disarming Silas and sending him sprawling to the ground. Martha screamed, her face contorted with fury. She lunged at Sarah, her hands outstretched, her nails bared like claws. Sarah, fueled by adrenaline, stood her ground. She grabbed a rock and raised it above her head, ready to defend herself and her children. But Little Bear intervened, grabbing Martha's arm and twisting it behind her back. She cried out in pain, her struggles futile. Little Bear held them both captive, his eyes blazing with anger. He could have killed them all, but he chose not to. He was a warrior, but he was not a murderer. He believed in justice, but he also believed in compassion. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a silent question. What should he do with them? Sarah hesitated. She wanted to see them punished for their cruelty, but she didn't want to be responsible for their deaths. "Let them go," she said softly. "Just make them leave and never come back." Little Bear nodded. He released Silas and Martha, warning them to leave and never return. The in-laws, defeated and humiliated, scrambled into their wagons and watched as the wagons disappeared over the horizon, a wave of relief washing over her. They were safe, at least for now, but she knew that they couldn't stay there. Silas and Martha might return, and even if they didn't, the wilderness was too dangerous for them to survive on their own. She turned to Little Bear, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved us again." Little Bear nodded, his expression serious. He knew that their journey was far from over. They needed to find a safe place to settle, a place where they could rebuild their lives without fear. Using gestures, he indicated that he knew of a nearby town, a small settlement located a few days' journey to the east. He explained that it was a place where they could find food, shelter, and protection. Sarah hesitated. She was wary of towns, of strangers, of the complexities of civilized life. But she knew that she had no other choice. For her children's sake, she had to take the risk. "Okay," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Let's go." Little Bear smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. He knew that the journey would be difficult, but he was confident that they could make it. He would protect them, guide them, and help them find a new home. They set off the next morning, following Little Bear as he led them through the rugged terrain. He knew the land intimately, navigating through hidden canyons and over rocky ridges. He pointed out edible plants, warned them of dangerous animals, and showed them how to find sources of fresh water. As they traveled, Sarah noticed a change in Little Bear's demeanor. He seemed more focused, more determined. She realized that he was eager to return to his own people, that he was fulfilling his duty to help them before continuing on his own journey. She felt a pang of sadness at the thought of them parting ways. She had grown to rely on Little Bear, to trust him, to love him. He had become more than just a protector. He had become a friend, a brother, a part of their family. But she knew that he had his own life to live, his own people to return to. She couldn't ask him to stay with them forever. All she could do was cherish the time they had together and hope that their paths would cross again someday. As they drew closer to the town, Sarah began to feel a sense of hope. She imagined a new life for herself and her children, a life free from fear and... The town of Harmony Creek was small, but it offered everything Sarah and her children needed. A safe place to live, a supportive community, and opportunities for a fresh start. The townsfolk, hearing their story, welcomed them with open arms, offering them food, clothing, and a small cabin on the outskirts of town. Sarah, with renewed hope, threw herself into rebuilding her life. She used the skills she had learned on the homestead to provide for her children. She started a small garden, growing vegetables and herbs. She sewed clothes for the townsfolk, mending tears and creating new garments. She even used her knowledge of herbs to create simple remedies, helping to heal the sick and injured. Thomas and Emily thrived in their new environment. They made friends with the other children in town, attending the small schoolhouse and learning to read and write. They helped Sarah with her chores, their small hands becoming increasingly skilled. Sarah never forgot Little Bear. She often thought of him, wondering if he had found his way back to his tribe. She told Thomas and Emily stories about him, reminding them of his kindness, his courage, and his unwavering loyalty. She wanted them to remember the Cheyenne warrior who had saved their lives, who had shown them the true meaning of compassion. She also never forgot Silas and Martha. She knew that they could return someday, seeking revenge. But she refused to live in fear. She was determined to build a better life for her children, a life free from the cruelty and greed that had driven her in-laws. As time passed, Sarah became a respected member of the Harmony Creek community. A kind and gentle farmer, named Caleb, saw something special in Sarah, something beyond her hardships and sorrows. He admired her strength, her courage, and her unwavering love for her children. He courted her with patience and respect, and eventually, Sarah opened her heart to him. They were married in the town square, surrounded by their friends and neighbors. Thomas and Emily served as ring bearer and flower girl, their faces radiant with joy. Sarah knew that Jebediah would have approved. She had found happiness again, and she was grateful for every moment. She looked at her children, her heart filled with love and gratitude. She was grateful for the hardships she had endured, for they had led her to this moment, to this place, to this new life. The time came for Little Bear to leave. He had helped Sarah and her children reach safety. He had protected them from danger, and he had shown them the true meaning of compassion. Now it was time for him to return to his own people, to his own family. He approached Sarah, his face filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Using gestures, he explained that he had to leave, that he had to find his way back to his tribe. Sarah understood. She knew that he couldn't stay with them forever. She felt a pang of sadness, but she also felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything he had done. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved our lives. You gave us hope. We will never forget you." Little Bear smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bear. He placed it in Emily's hand, a symbol of his protection and his love. He then turned to Thomas and gave him a small, smooth stone, a reminder of his courage and his strength. He pointed to the east, indicating the direction of his tribe. He then pointed to the sky, indicating that he would always remember them. He promised to visit them again someday, if fate allowed. With a final nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the vastness of the plains. Sarah watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. She knew that she might never see him again, but she also knew that his spirit would always be with them. Years passed. Thomas and Emily grew into strong, kind, and compassionate adults. They never forgot Little Bear, and they often shared stories about him with their own children. Sarah lived a long and happy life, surrounded by her family and her friends. She never forgot the hardships she had endured, but she also never forgot the kindness and compassion she had received. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah sat on her porch, watching her grandchildren play, she saw a familiar figure approaching. It was an old man, his face etched with the wisdom of years, but his eyes still filled with the same warmth and kindness she remembered. It was Little Bear. He had returned, just as he had promised. He had traveled many miles, across vast plains and over towering mountains, just to see her and her children again. Sarah rose from her chair, her heart